Marcus drove in silence through the new city, trying to contain the mix of anxiety and excitement he felt beside him. Jasmine looked out the window, observing the streets, the houses, and the details of a place that they would soon call home. After so many struggles and barriers, they had finally made it. This was a new phase of their lives. The change was not just physical, it was symbolic. He had a fresh start ahead of him, but something fell out of place as he passed a police car parked on the corner. Marcus noticed the two officers inside the vehicle staring at him in a way he recognized all too well: suspicion. They followed him with their eyes as he slowly drove down the street. His instinct kicked in immediately, a silent alarm that Marcus had learned to heed. Over time, he didn't say anything to Jasmine, but he could feel the tension in his own shoulders. A few seconds later, the police car's lights came on, followed by the sound of the siren. Paul over shouted the voice over the police car's loudspeaker. Marcus sighed, his heart racing. Seriously, he murmured. He glanced quickly at Jasmine, who was already tense, and pulled the car over to the shoulder. This wasn't the first time he had been stopped without cause, and a part of him knew it wouldn't be the last. The two officers jumped out of the car hurriedly, their expressions loaded with arrogance and something Marcus recognized immediately: prejudice. One of them, a middle-aged white man with a stiff and intimidating posture, approached the car without so much as a greeting license and registration. Now he demanded, his voice dry and laced with disdain. Marcus kept calm even as he felt his stomach churn. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but he also knew that in those moments being polite and correct was not always enough. Sure, officer, he said, reaching for his wallet and handing over the documents. The officer took them with a brusque gesture, flipping through them rapidly without even looking at Marcus. Where are you coming from? Asked the second officer, a younger man, but with the same disrespectful attitude. We're moving here, Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice neutral, not hiding the irritation that was beginning to bubble beneath the surface. The younger officer let out a short, mocking laugh. Moving, huh? Where to exactly? He looked over at Jasmine with blatant disrespect, his eyes conveying a kind of baseless suspicion, as if she were hiding something. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He knew what was happening here. It wasn't about where he was going or where he was from. It was about who he was, or rather how he looked. The first officer glanced back at the documents and then back at Marcus. This car yours seems a bit too nice for someone like you. The phrase was casually spoken, but the venom was in the subtext. Jasmine clenched her fists, but Marcus discreetly held her hand, calming her. Yes, it's mine. Any problem with that? Marcus replied, looking directly into the officer's eyes, who turned away, irritated by the firm response. The younger officer walked around the car and approached Jasmine. Get out of the car, he ordered, not even looking at Marcus, as if he hadn't said anything. Jasmine hesitated, her eyes searching Marcus's, who gave a slight nod, knowing that resisting could make things worse. She got out of the car, and the officer began to search her unnecessarily, almost as if he wanted to prove a point. But Marcus said nothing. Yet he was waiting for the right moment to act. Anything illegal going on with you two? Asked the older officer, as he fiddled with the documents without really paying attention. Someone like you driving a car like this doesn't seem right. What are you doing here? Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling the weight of injustice grow. We're moving. I don't see a reason for this kind of stop. The officer laughed dryly. I do. There's something odd about this story. He glanced at his partner, who seemed to be enjoying himself as he rummaged through the trunk of the car. People like you always have something hidden. People like me? Marcus finally asked, his voice coming out a bit. Marcus's words came out firmer than he had planned, cutting through the tension like a blade. The older officer paused for a beat, his eyes narrowing as if calculating whether or not Marcus's defiance was worth addressing. Finally, with a sneer curling his lip, he muttered, "Don't get smart with me, man. You don't want to make this worse for yourself." Before Marcus could reply, the younger officer slammed the trunk shut with an exaggerated force, making Jasmine flinch. He stepped forward, his posture radiating hostility, towering over Marcus as he demanded, "Get out of the car." Jasmine turned to Marcus, her eyes filled with silent concern. His patience was fraying, but he nodded gently at her, silently conveying that he had everything under control, or at least he hoped he did. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out, careful to keep his hands visible, a practiced move ingrained from too many encounters like this. As Marcus stood, the older officer wasted no time invading his personal space. He closed the distance, standing chest to chest with him, his stance aggressive, his tone taunting. "If you've got nothing to hide, then why are you so nervous?" he provoked, the words dripping with mockery. Marcus took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying himself as the officer's words hung in the air. Around them, the sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of gold and amber. In the growing dusk, Marcus noticed shadows shifting behind the nearby windows, curious neighbors peeking out to witness the commotion. He could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken judgment, the assumption of guilt. He knew he needed to choose his next words carefully. Every syllable mattered now. "Officers," he began, his voice measured but firm, "there's absolutely no reason for this stop. You don't have any justification for what you're doing here." The officers exchanged a glance, their surprise evident for a fleeting moment. They hadn't expected him to stand his ground so boldly. But the older officer quickly recovered, crossing his arms and smirking with a condescension that made Marcus's blood boil. "No justification," he echoed mockingly. "We'll see about that. Once we're done here." Marcus clenched his fists at his sides, forcing himself to remain composed despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. He knew the deeper truth behind their actions, the ugly undercurrent of prejudice that had followed him and Jasmine to this very moment. This wasn't about the stop itself, it was about the systemic bias that turned routine encounters into ordeals. The younger officer, clearly emboldened by his partner's arrogance, turned his attention back to Jasmine. His gaze was filled with a kind of contempt that made Marcus's stomach churn. After casting a dismissive glance in her direction, he stepped closer to Marcus, his tone sharper now. "You really don't seem to understand how this works," he said. "We ask the questions and you just answer. Now, are you going to tell us why you're here, or do we need to handle this another way?" Marcus exhaled slowly, his frustration nearing its breaking point. The contempt in their voices, the blatant abuse of power, and the disrespectful way they treated Jasmine, it was all too much. Over the years, Marcus had endured countless moments like this. He'd felt the sting of judgment in every suspicious glance, every unwarranted stop. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't just another target of their disdain. He straightened his posture, his shoulders squaring as he met the older officer's gaze head-on. "You want to know who I am?" Marcus said, his voice steady, carrying an edge of defiance. "It's time you found out." Both officers exchanged another look, this time with smirks tugging at their lips. The younger one chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "Oh, this ought to be good," he said with a sneer. "You gonna impress us now? Let's hear it." Marcus didn't react to their mockery. Instead, he reached for the inner pocket of his jacket, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The officers, conditioned by their own arrogance and assumptions, tensed immediately. The older one barked, Hey, what do you think you're doing?" His hand moved instinctively toward his belt, ready to escalate the situation. With calm, measured movements, Marcus withdrew a small leather case and opened it, holding it up for them to see. The gold lettering on the badge inside gleamed faintly in the fading light, and the air around them seemed to shift. The moment their eyes landed on the badge, their expressions transformed. The arrogance that had painted their faces mere seconds ago evaporated, replaced by wide-eyed shock. The younger officer blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing as if struggling to form words. The older officer froze, his sarcastic smirk vanishing completely. What is this?" the younger one stammered, his voice faltering. Marcus stepped forward, his calm unshaken, his presence commanding. "I'm Marcus Foster," he said, his tone unyielding, "and you just made a serious mistake." The two officers stood rooted in place, their confidence crumbling as the weight of Marcus's words sank in. He continued, his voice like steel. "I'm the new chief of police for this district." The silence that followed was deafening. The younger officer's face turned pale, while the older one took a hesitant step back, his bravado replaced by uncertainty. Whatever power they thought they had moments ago was gone, leaving them scrambling to process the gravity of their actions. The two officers stood frozen, their confidence crumbling like a house of cards. The older officer opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. His arrogance, so glaring just moments before, had dissolved into uneasy silence. Jasmine, who had remained quiet and watchful throughout, stepped closer to Marcus. Her expression was a mix of support and disbelief as she glanced at the now unnerved officers. "Chief of Police," the younger officer finally stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He repeated himself, as if saying the words might somehow make them less real. We didn't know. This was a misunderstanding." Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. His voice was calm but firm, carrying the authority of a man who had endured enough. "A misunderstanding?" He stepped forward, locking eyes with both men. "You stopped my car without cause. You humiliated me in front of my wife, treated me like a criminal, and now you want to call this a misunderstanding?"
No.
"What you did wasn't a mistake. It was an abuse of power. It was prejudice, plain and simple." The older officer blinked rapidly, as if trying to wake himself from a bad dream. "Sir, Chief, we didn't mean to, we apologize," he stammered, his voice lacking its earlier bravado. The word apologize hung in the air, hollow and insincere. To Marcus, it wasn't enough. It never was. Apologies couldn't erase the humiliation he had endured, nor could they undo the harm inflicted on countless others who weren't in a position to defend themselves. He took a step closer, his voice steady and unyielding. "Apologies won't fix this," he said, his tone measured but resolute. "What you did today cannot be undone with empty words. I could let this slide, accept your apology and move on, but that wouldn't be justice. And justice is what we're here for. You will be held accountable." The silence that followed was suffocating. The two officers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence replaced with visible panic. The weight of Marcus's words had begun to sink in, and for the first time, they seemed to realize the gravity of their actions. The older officer, his voice trembling, tried again. "Sir, please, we don't need to take this any further. We were just doing our duty." "Your duty?" Marcus interrupted, his voice rising slightly as he shook his head in disbelief. "You call this harassment and humiliation duty? You think it's your job to make baseless assumptions about honest citizens, to let prejudice guide your actions?" "No." He paused, his voice steadying again. "This stops here. Right now." He took a deep breath, his next words final. "We're going to the station. I'll be filing a formal complaint, and you will answer for your actions." The officers' faces turned ghostly pale. For the first time, they seemed to truly understand the repercussions of their behavior. The younger one, desperate now, began to plead. "Sir, please, we know we were wrong. It doesn't have to end like this." Marcus met his gaze, his tone calm but unyielding. "You made your choices. Now you'll face the consequences." Without another word, the officers retreated to their patrol car, their postures defeated. Jasmine turned to Marcus, her expression softening. She gave him a small nod, her silent way of showing her support. As Marcus and Jasmine returned to their car, the weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. The drive to the station was silent but charged, the tension between them and the officers palpable. For Marcus, this was no longer just about the two men who had harassed him and his wife. This was about something far greater, a system that had allowed this behavior to thrive unchecked. When they arrived at the station, Marcus stepped out of his car with firm strides, his resolve etched into every movement. The officers followed, their heads bowed, the confidence they had displayed earlier completely gone. Inside, Marcus walked straight to the front desk, his eyes fixed on the officer in charge. "I'm here to file a complaint," he said, his voice steady. "Two officers abused their authority today, and they must be held accountable." With those words, Marcus began a journey that would define not just his role as chief of police, but also his commitment to justice. This wasn't just about correcting a wrong, it was about ensuring that such wrongs would no longer go unchecked. He knew the fight ahead would be difficult, but he was ready for it. He wasn't just fighting for himself or for Jasmine. He was fighting for every person who had ever been mistreated, for a system that desperately needed change, and for a future where accountability and fairness would prevail.